We're going to explore a theory from two perspectives. One is from Glenn Simpson, and another one from a guy named Abraham Wallach.
First of all, Donald has no sense of obligation, even if somebody's investing money with him.
Wallach worked for Trump for 12 years. He and Simpson don't agree on everything, but there's one central point the two both make. Trump has engaged in some serious alternative financing. Let's start with Simpson. For years, as a reporter at the Wall Street Journal, he covered financial crimes, money laundering, Russian oligarchs. In 2009, he leaves the paper to start his own firm, Fusion GPS. He continues to do journalistic investigations, but for law firms, companies who want to understand their competitors, that sort of thing. He's called it journalism for rent. And then, in 2015, he gets some new clients, one backed by Republicans, and then later, one linked to Hillary Clinton. The clients want him to investigate Trump's businesses, find out everything he can. So Simpson and a bunch of staffers get to work on the investigation. But they want to know more, so they hire the former British spy, Chris Steele. And that's the origin of the dossier. All of this information basically remains secret until BuzzFeed posts the dossier online, just before Trump is inaugurated. It causes a year of controversy, becoming a central part of the Trump collusion investigations. Congress calls Simpson to testify. Republicans accuse him of being the one who is doing the colluding with the Russians.
A key figure behind the controversial dossier detailing unsubstantiated allegations about the Trump team's ties to Russia is set to speak with investigators on Capitol Hill today.
Republicans in Congress today will step up efforts to find out who and what was behind that controversial so-called dossier.
Since the dossier was published, Simpson's been sued by Russian bankers and the president's attorney for defamation. Simpson isn't making further public comments. And his testimony to Congress, it was behind closed doors. There are no recordings, no photos, no videos.
Hi, I'm Kelly O'Coin.
So we got someone else to read Simpson's testimony.
I played Dollar Bill Stern on the Showtime series Billions.
He's got his own Russia connections.
And also Pastor Tim on The Americans, a Cold War drama about Soviet sleeper spies trying to access the highest levels of the American government.
Kelly O'Coin is going to read Simpson's exact words from the transcript. Think of this as a historical reenactment. So he's playing a guy in a hearing room in the U.S. Capitol, facing a panel of legislators and their staff. People are told to leave all their electronics outside: BlackBerries, iPhones, pagers, recording devices, Bluetooth wristbands. The Republicans are pretty hostile. They're trying to show that Simpson and the Hillary Clinton campaign set up the Russia conspiracy to entrap the Trump campaign. So they asked Simpson what he was doing all that time investigating Trump's business.
I think I can speak more broadly and say that it was an open-ended look at Donald Trump's business career and his litigation history and his relationships with questionable people, how much he was really worth, how he ran his casinos, what kind of performance he had in other lines of work.
Simpson hadn't really known anything about Trump's business. His assignment? To learn everything there was to know.
It was a very broad, unfocused look, which is the way we do our business.
Simpson tells Congress, as part of his research, he read everything he could: books, court records, financial documents from around the globe. What we are going to do is listen to Simpson's testimony, and then Jesse, Adam, and I are going to break it down. First, Adam.
I really feel for Glenn Simpson when he talks about this moment of, we're just looking at Trump business. We don't really know anything. And, you know, Glenn Simpson, like me and Jesse, were longtime business reporters, which is to say we have never thought about the Trump business before recently. It's just not an important business.
When I started calling around, when I started really being interested in this, and I started calling around to people on Wall Street, in commercial real estate, none of them knew anything about the Trump organization either, because it was such an irrelevancy. It was such a minor operation. You really suddenly got this sense that it was just a mom and pop shop operating on the fringes.
Or a pop and kids.
Pop and kids shop. Exactly.
In his testimony, Simpson tells how it just took a Google search to find Russian businessmen working with Trump.
That's pretty troubling. As we've got deeper and deeper into understanding, Donald Trump's business career and his history, it gradually reached the point where it seemed like most of the people around Trump had a connection to Russian organized crime, or Russia in one way or another.
But Simpson points out something strange, which is, in spite of having all these connections to Russia,
So there was all that.
Trump never built anything there.
We also increasingly saw that Mr. Trump's business career had evolved over the prior decade into a lot of projects in overseas places, particularly in the Soviet Union, that were very opaque. And that he'd made a number of trips to Russia, but said he'd never done a business deal there. And I found that mysterious.
This is a puzzle for many reasons.
That's Adam Davidson speaking.
One thing is, over this period of time, if you think about, Trump first went there when it was still the Soviet Union. He claimed to be negotiating for a Trump Tower, Kremlin Square. There was a lot of money made by a lot of not very impressive people in Russia in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And someone who had that many ties and that much of a relationship to make no money, according to what he says, to have no deals there, that's very puzzling.
So why? What's going on? Well, maybe he's completely incompetent. With Trump, you can't ever eliminate that possibility. But Glenn starts thinking that there's something else going on, that he is successful in these trips.
The most fundamental question is, does this make normal business sense? And I think Glenn Simpson's strong suspicion is these trips were very profitable.
Simpson has a theory about Trump's Russia connection. The theory is rooted in two things we know were happening around this time. The first is that Trump was having a harder and harder time getting traditional kinds of bank financing for his projects.
Right. And why is he having that difficulty? Because he's had a series of catastrophic failures over and over again. His casinos have gone bust. His buildings keep going into receivership. He's not a good credit anymore. And so major Western banks don't want to give him money, but that doesn't stop his need for money. And so he's got to find alternative ways, and he starts going around the world seeking capital.
The second thing is that in the early 2000s, there was a lot of money being made in Russia, and really rich Russians did not want to keep it there.
There's huge amounts of capital piling up in oil-rich countries like Russia and Arab countries and Venezuela and other places. And a lot of this is illegal money, trillions of dollars of illegal money. And that money needs to find a place to go. It needs to find a place to go because there's just, if you want to actually invest in Russia, there's not that much to invest in.
And these are the two things we know were happening. Trump had a problem getting traditional bank financing for his projects, and Russians were trying to get money out of Russia.
What I later came to believe was that he was, in fact, developing different kinds of business relationships with the Russians and, the sort of marquee thing that he always talked about, which was building a tower in Moscow. And that, in fact, he'd found other ways to profit from his relationship with that.
So this is the point of the testimony where I really got interested. Because what Glenn says is he realizes he's been looking for a tall tower in Moscow, and he's been looking for the wrong thing.
And what we, gradually begun to understand, which, I suppose I should kick myself for not figuring out earlier, but by 2003, 2004, Donald Trump was not able to get bank credit for it. And if you're a real estate developer and you can't get bank loans, you've got a problem.
Simpson comes to believe Trump has a workaround. He and his partners can't get straight-up financing to build Trump towers around the world. But if they can sell enough units when the projects are just a pitch, say 60, 65%, Trump and his partners can use those early sales to convince banks to give them money. Simpson calls this alternative financing.
So the real trick is to get people who say they bought those units, and that's where the Russians are to be found, is in some of those pre-sales, is what they're called. And that's how, for instance, in Panama, they got a Bear Stearns to issue a bond by telling Bear Stearns that they'd sold a bunch of units to a bunch of Russian gangsters. And of course, they didn't put that in the underwriting information. They just said, we sold a bunch of units, and here's who bought them, and that's how they got the credit. And so that's sort of an example of the alternative financing.
This is such an important point. We've been struck, as we've looked at deals the world over, that the Trump Organization, at the early stages of a project, often puts out a statement that the building is around 60% sold. That number pops up with remarkable frequency. And what Glenn Simpson is saying is, It's a business model, alternative financing.
It was just a very clear and simple idea, which, he says, I could kick myself for not figuring it out earlier, which is just, Trump was going to a place that had a lot of money. It was trying to get into the West illegally. Trump wanted a lot of money to get into the West and was not particularly persnickety about the legality of it. And the two met and worked out a bunch of deals. Like that feels like that makes sense of the facts of the case with utter clarity. They explain to me everything. And the alternative explanation that Trump was in earnest trying to do successful, good, fully legitimate projects, and just for whatever reason it never worked, I find very hard to believe.
Simpson's theory explains not only what Trump might have gotten out of his business dealings with Russians, but also what Russians got out of it. A place to put their money. Take golf courses. Simpson noticed some large and what he found unexplained infusions of cash into Trump's golf courses, which nowadays tend to be money losers, unattractive investments.
We saw what Eric Trump said about Russian money being available for the golf course projects, making remarks about having unlimited sums available.
Eric Trump has disavowed these remarks, but here's what golf reporter James Dodson quoted him as saying. We don't rely on American banks. We have all the funding we need out of Russia.
So we were able to get the financial statements.
Because UK disclosure law is different from in the US, Simpson did get to review records for the golf courses.
And they don't, on their face, show Russian involvement. But what they do show is enormous amounts of capital flowing into these projects from unknown sources. Or at least on paper, it says it's from the Trump Organization, but it's hundreds of millions of dollars. So, if you're familiar with Donald Trump's finances and the litigation over whether he's really a billionaire, there's good reason to believe that he doesn't have enough money to do this.
An important note, neither Donald Trump nor his business has ever been charged with money laundering.